All right, I figured I would make a little video to convince you to buy emacs stock, and gonna kind of really push the boundaries on thought leadership and tap into the vast amounts of emacs users out there and really drive up those YouTube views. So what I wanted to show you is kind of a live demo of some of the stuff I've been playing with in the evening, and also kind of show why emacs is a lot cooler than a lot of people realize. So first and foremost, emacs is cool because it's a big list, and you can add things to the list and remove things from the list, and that list is also code, and that makes it magic and special, right? All jokes aside, the cool thing about emacs is that you kind of glue everything into it. And then one of the things that I like to do with it is remove stutter from things that I do a lot throughout the day, like popping into shells and visiting certain files and URIs. So I heavily use its bookmark system to kind of jump all over the place, and I have a custom bookmark layer that will kind of let me jump to other things that aren't just the normal emacs bookmarks. So I can jump to URIs and shell locations and things like that. So I also have a little like shell jumper in there that lets me do things like this, right? So I can just jump into a shell, and that's a real terminal that's running on top of something called vterm, which is an actual real terminal emulator. Because of regular emacs buffers and terminal emulation in emacs itself is a little shaky, because it turns out that having real terminal emulation is a dark, dense forest of decades of weird behavior that you have to deal with. So usually you don't need a real terminal for most of the things that you're doing, but when I do need one, I'll pop into a vterm thing, right? So that's cool. So I wanted to plug that into, I wanted to plug gsocket support into there. So one of the things I did was have that a jumper also handle the gsocket protocol. And then now this is a remote shell jumping over gsocket. And then gsocket is basically a network mixer, a very German network mixer, where two endpoints with a shared secret can meet in the middle. And that is convenient when you're behind a firewall, or something's running behind a firewall that you don't necessarily want to open up or don't have the ability to open up. So in situations like that where administration absolutely has to occur, you can use something like gsocket. Or in this case, gsnetcat is the name of the tool, and the gsocket is the library, and the protocol is called GSRN, which is the Global Socket Relay Network. So that's cool, right? It jumps me into a terminal, and I can do terminal-y things with it, which is nice. But you want to take that one step further when you're in Emacs land. I'm like, hey, sometimes I don't want to jump to a terminal just to open a file and then edit that file and then save that file and all that stuff, right? Sometimes I want to do that directly. So you can do that with the tramp layer. So tramp layer is basically a layer in Emacs that's integrated into almost everything, and it lets you specify protocol URIs that are then handled by Emacs in terms of transferring data on top of that protocol. And most of the old school ones are just shell based. So the cool thing about that is that we have a tool that can reliably create a shell. Then Emacs can run on top of that and do everything it does on top of that for the most part, including directory editing, opening and writing files, transferring files, all that kind of stuff. It just runs on top of the shell. It's kind of like a very old school way of doing things, but it still works very nicely. So because gsnetcat essentially just pops a shell, we can plug that into tramp with a couple of lines of elisp, and basically to define the methods that tramp needs to know about in, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines of Lisp, and or 5 entries of Lisp in the list essentially, and shovel that into the A list for tramp methods, and now we have tramp support for gsocket, right? So what that looks like is you can do things like this now. So you can say ESRN, and I want to go to caretaker at lab, and I want to open etc. hosts, right? And that is now me editing this file on a remote system over the the network mixer over gsocket. And that's pretty cool, right? And that works everywhere magically now. So I can do weird things like this. I can open a G shell, E shell, not G shell, and do the same thing. I can just toggle into that remote context by doing things like this. And this is a little laggy because I want to go in there and say, oh, the autocomplete. I really need to toggle off the autocomplete when I'm working with gsocket shells because they're a little laggy sometimes. But that's basically the idea. So that'll do everything that's happening inside of this context when it says GSRN blah 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 blah, that's happening on the remote host, and then I can switch out of that pretty easily as well. The autocomplete is kicking in again, and that takes me out of that context, out of the remote context. So that's kind of awesome. So the main advantage of that is that you could also do, technically, if you had a very reliable tool that would repeatedly give you a shell on something, you could actually plug that in directly into tramp and give that a method and chain those, surprisingly enough, pretty straightforward because the URI. Tramp supports chaining the nodes in the URI formatting, and then it'll actually hop through multiple nodes. So as long as you have the tool that you want to hop to the next node with on the on each entry of the chain, then that'll work just fine, which is pretty convenient, especially if you're from the 80s.